Motherboard manufacturers are constantly vying over drawing the sword from the stone to see who can become the king of bullshit a lot. And that's what we're talking about today. It's the marketing angle and how motherboard makers have it really tough. They're trying to market a product whose performance is mostly contingent on which CPU or GPU is socketed into it. And it gets difficult to market on things like power delivery because most users don't care or understand what it is. And so they have to start figuring out other ways to market their product, and that mostly boils down to sort of cheating the numbers or slightly fudging things like B-clock and changing it 0.3 megahertz to try and make their numbers look higher than the next person's numbers in a chart. Now we're just tweaking what Intel or AMD does out of the box, and that's not really fair, especially if you're expecting users or reviewers to compare numbers with one another, because now it's all meaningless. So we're gonna be talking about MCE once again and showing you a massive assortment of charts on what the different Z490 boards do when they violate or don't violate the Intel official guidance. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and our brand new Gamers Nexus wireframe mouse mat. Aside from being the best way to directly support our long-form investigative reporting, you can also get a custom-made, high-quality mouse mat made with a high-detail 3D design that we created to show off heat sinks, coolers, video cards, and more. The mouse mat uses a stitched blue border for added longevity, a blue rubber underside for unique flare, and a microfiber cloth for smooth tracking. The mat is 36 inches by 12 inches and fits a keyboard and mouse easily. We sold out of the first run in 48 hours, but have more getting made right now. To backorder your mouse mat and ensure you get one in the next run, go to store.gamersnexus.net and backorder yours while reducing our reliance on advertisers, or click the link in the description below. There's a lot of data to get through today, so to really set the stage first, we have a separate video on this, but the short of it is Intel's official guidance, which is what it's technically called, is not technically an Intel spec, but we often call it that because ultimately this comes down to being reasonable as a consumer, as a user of the hardware, and Intel's marketing the processors a certain way, AMD markets their processors a certain way. Our job is to test that the marketing claims line up with reality. Not that the motherboard manufacturer, who effectively pre-overclocks at 700 megahertz all core, is lining up with Intel's claims. That's not our job, because that's a motherboard review, or at least some kind of weird like pre-overclocked review thing. So we're gonna be talking about PL1, PL2, and Tau again, but this time with a lot more detail, including charts with Vcore. We're gonna be showing thermals and the massive thermal impact that a motherboard can have on the CPU. We'll also be exploring how a lot of the times the Intel is hot and high power consumption is tied to something the motherboard's doing more so than the CPU itself. These aren't wholly untrue things to say, but the degree to which they are true is variable. And variable truth is one of the most difficult things to work with as an objective reviewer. We've talked about Intel turbo and multi-core enhancement many times in the past. This serves as a companion piece to the most recent of these, which is our Intel i9-10900K power consumption explained video. To reiterate, Intel's specification and Intel's official guidance are technically two different things, but that's getting into a semantics discussion that we'll talk about later. Intel's spec defines turbo limits, the multipliers for boosting on one core, two cores, etc., all the way up to an all-core turbo boost, and it also defines a base clock. For example, the 10900K's limited core turbo multiplier at the max is 53x on some cores and 49x on all cores when the CPU is operating below 70 degrees Celsius for TVB, or thermal velocity boost, in order to hit 53x for the limited core boosting. Breaking these turbo limits is considered overclocking. If you went to 54, for example, or 52 all core. Intel also has guidelines for short-term power draw, long-term power draw, and for boost duration. These variables are not technically part of the enforced specification, so breaking the suggested limits is not considered overclocking, and motherboard manufacturers can go wild pushing these limits to the highest values that the assigned bytes can hold. This results in the problem we're talking about today: thermal issues and performance issues that are completely out of line with what the processor's listed capabilities would suggest, or even just being unstable. For example, a 10900K will run at 4.9 gigahertz under an all-core load forever in many boards, whereas stock testing with the Intel stock limits applied shows the CPU running at 4.1 to 4.2 gigahertz all-core after a 56-second period. To reinforce this, recently we've even had several of you tweet at us or post comments about how MCE and similar basically overclocking features caused system instability, blue screens, or other troubleshooting challenges while the board was running at what you thought was stock. And that's because it was effectively pre-overclocked by the manufacturer just without asking you. Pay close attention though to our use of the word effectively here, because it isn't officially overclocking. Ultimately, that's what's going on though. The clock is higher than expected. You might even say it's over what the expected value is. And so we ignore the semantics of spec, guidance, and overclocking, and instead go with what makes the most actual sense for the user, bullshit marketing labels aside. Here's a preview of the problem. We'll get into more testing results and methodology in a moment, but this sets the stage. Each of these numbers on the screen now was taken with a current clamp over the EPS 12-volt cables before VRM efficiency losses, but after the wall. The blender measurement, both within the 56-second window and after the 5-minute mark, helps show what settings are either used or ignored. The difference between using Intel guidelines and using some form of MCE can be the difference between 118 watts and 244 watts, as seen here. That's also the difference in cooler choice, because now you're dealing with substantially more power, and the cooler needs to be able to handle that. It's further the difference in stability for some systems, depending on how well the motherboard maker has tuned this. We picked a selection of motherboards from different manufacturers and tested them at default settings using an i9-10900K and the RAM and GPU from our CPU review bench. When we say motherboard default settings, what we mean is resetting the board entirely to defaults with no changes other than maxing out the fan speeds for some control. This is in contrast to the stock CPU test we do for reviews, where we set RAM frequency and timings manually, we explicitly disable MCE, we set the correct DRAM voltage, a couple of other things as well, and we also make sure that B clock is 100.00. The latest publicly available BIOS was used for all motherboards shown in the testing today, except for the MSI Ace, where we used a reviewer BIOS to avoid some other potential issues outside of the scope of this content piece. The ASUS Extreme also used our reviewer BIOS that we used for the Comet Lake CPU reviews in the 10th generation of Intel CPUs. We use a Kraken X62 CLC at max pump and fan speeds for all desktop class CPU testing, and you can learn more about our CPU test bench component selection and methodology in our standalone test methods piece. The temperatures getting charted now were calculated by averaging the per core temperature and taking a delta against the ambient room temperature, which was measured every second of the test with a separate meter. The truncated scale is to help illustrate the change on the line plot, and it tops out at 50 because it's DT over ambient, and we're trying to see the difference. The 10900K installed in the Gigabyte Master, which we already know from our first chart consumed the most power during this test, reached a steady state at about 49 degrees Celsius over ambient. Meanwhile, the same CPU in the more conservative ASUS Hero leveled out at 22 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient. Note that there are significant differences between all of the boards. Even the two that obey stock limits are significantly different. Anyone running the 10900K at default settings in the Tai Chi, the Ace, or the Master would conclude that it's a much hotter CPU at stock settings than we know it to be from our review. It's hard to overstate how huge a gap 27 degrees Celsius is at steady state. That's orders of magnitude higher than what we see for deltas in cooler reviews. And we can put one of those on the screen. If we put a CPU cooler chart on the screen from our Liquid Freezer 2 review, it becomes clear that the cooler itself matters a lot less than the power going into the CPU, especially when the same CPU, under what a user would presume is stock settings, can draw 100 watts more in one board versus the next without the user actually changing anything. So the CPU, despite being the thing that sets the requirement for coolers to begin with, should be relatively consistent, at least if it's not manually overclocked. And in this case, it wasn't. It was overclocked by the board by default. Back to our thermal line plot now. It's clear where Intel gets its hot and power-hungry meme status online, and that's from its motherboard partners. Although the other boards run at a higher frequency, they also run at over-aggressive voltage settings and are responsible for the high temperatures you see most of the time. That said, Intel CPUs certainly are less efficient in most instances than AMD's directly competing parts, meaning that although the AMD part might draw 25 more watts, like the R9-3900X versus the 10900K, the AMD part is able to complete most tasks, but not all, with reduced time. So although the 3900X here is drawing more power for more cores, it's also completing the renders in significantly less time and therefore is more efficient. But either way, the hot and power-hungry status of the 10 series is largely attributable to motherboards, not Intel. Intel's not as bad as it's being made out to look. For a clue as to what's going on, we can next look at Vcore, as represented by Hardware Info. To really do this properly, we'd hook up a DMM into each board and look at it that way. So this is a quick spot check using software. Unfortunately, ASRock's board reported an obviously incorrect number, and Hardware Info hadn't yet labeled a Vcore entry for the MSI Ace at the time of testing. We could go back and log with a DMM or a scope, as we have for pieces about MSE in the past, but this is enough to get the point across that we're making here. The ASUS Extreme reports a Vcore of 1.128 volts under all-core load, and then it drops sharply to 1.012 or 1.03 volts after the 56-second turbo limit expires. Even with whatever error exists in the software approach, the point is still clear. There's a firm drop as the need to maintain stable, high frequency is also reduced. The Hero follows the same trend, but with a slightly lower auto Vcore after the time limit. The Gigabyte Master, on the other hand, reported exactly 1.272 volts, flat throughout the entirety of the test. That's 1.272 volts for an all-core frequency of only 4.9 gigahertz. For perspective, we achieved 5.2 on the same CPU with a reported Vcore of about 1.296 in the ASUS Maximus Extreme. And we also got up to 5.3 in gaming with a similar voltage. One of the greatest weaknesses of pushing ambitious default settings is that the motherboard makers have to cater to the lowest common denominator and the lowest quality silicon. This is why websites like siliconlottery.com exist, because they bin the parts to find the best parts. And motherboard makers don't know what you're going to end up with. So if Gigabyte decides that a 10900K exists that needs 1.272 volts to run at 4.9 all-core permanently forever, they have to make that the all-core voltage for every 10900K ever to socket into these boards, which is bad news for you. Again, these are software logs of data reported by the motherboards, and the current clamp chart at the beginning of this piece is a more objectively accurate depiction of CPU power in watts. But clearly the auto Vcore assigned to the 10900K on the Gigabyte board is both higher and sustained for longer. This is illustrated clearly in our power logs from the clamp, and it's not the first time that Gigabyte has been guilty of excessive Vcore. A piece that we wrote in 2017 demonstrated this exact issue. That's how long we've been fighting this fight, and there are people out there who've been fighting it for longer. Here's a chart for package power, a data point that's tracked on all 5 motherboards by Hardware Info. Again, the caveat about this being a software report by each individual motherboard rather than an external measurement with a clamp still applies, especially since the clamp reported the Taichi drawing slightly more power on EPS 12-volt cables than the Ace. Further, note that the clamp doesn't account for VRM efficiency losses, so although the clamp numbers are considered good enough for CPU power measurement, you'd need finer control for direct board-to-board comparisons, but that's not really our goal here today, and ultimately none of these options are perfect anyway. Nonetheless, this method of measurement does appear to correspond directly with the PL1 and PL2 we saw above. Neither of the 2 ASUS boards hit the 250 watt PL2 limit in the initial turbo boost, as they didn't require the headroom and aren't as abusive on voltage. As soon as the time limit was up, both were locked down to the 125 watt PL1 limit at whatever settings they required to hit that threshold. The other boards without any such limits reported much higher power levels, with the Master reaching 237 watts package power, reasonably close to the 244 watts check with the clamp. Now let's look at the actual CPU frequencies. This is what dictates performance results in games or other applications, and is the most important takeaway from the point of fair performance comparisons between brands. In this test, the 10900K behaved similarly with the Ace and the Taichi, which we'll plot first. The Taichi was almost constantly at 5300 MHz and boosting more than just the expected cores. This behavior would boost the result higher than other boards as well, which would increase the scoring. That makes ASRock look better on the charts and is why they're doing it. At the same time, it threatens system stability in some use cases, as our viewers have aptly voiced, and it also requires a more serious cooling setup and power source. The Ace is similar in its behavior. The Extreme shows us how the performance should look. The Aorus Master exhibited the most stock behavior, in giant air quotes there, staying at 5.1 GHz for the most part, with occasional bursts to 5.3 GHz on cores 8 and 9. The 2 ASUS boards followed the same pattern, but with marginally higher frequencies due to some B clock manipulation that we'll discuss later on. The Taichi and the Ace both kept at least one core boosted to 5.3 GHz, much more often than the Gigabyte or ASUS motherboards. Examining a couple of boards individually, we can see that the Taichi boosts to 5.3 GHz on any core it pleases, often on 3 of 4 cores at once, which breaks even the rules the motherboard has set for itself, since the 3-core active limit on the Taichi is reported to be still 51x. In contrast, the Extreme is only allowed to boost to 53x on cores 8 and 9, and in this test it only actually uses core 8, and even then it boosts sparingly. In our review, we did see it use core 9 on occasion, but it depends run to run. This clearly can influence the performance massively depending on which board you're testing and how. If testing with the ASRock Taichi board at stock settings, then you end up with a benchmark result that is influenced in a positive direction, and primarily an unrealistically positive direction, by using that board's stock settings. Again, we view the ASUS stock settings as more correct, but it too has some issues. For the all-core blender test, let's take the average core frequency rather than the maximum limited core boost. The Ace, Master, and Taichi all kept the 10900K locked to a steady 4.9 GHz through the entire test, as could be predicted based on the MCE settings. 4.9 GHz is the maximum limited time all-core turbo, and increasing the limits will keep that turbo sustained forever and outside of guidance. Again, if you're going to test like this or run your computer like this when you do your build, it's functionally a pre-overclock. And it's also, from a testing standpoint, the reason we don't do it this way, it's also unfair to AMD to leave their power limits in place. And it's unfair to Intel because now it looks like they're drawing more power and they're running hotter. So everybody loses here. It's just that there are individual wins depending on which graph you look at. The motherboard manufacturers end up the happiest because Intel takes the heat for the heat and the power, and they get to look like they're better than the other guys. Both AMD and Intel have to be treated the same way, regardless of semantics. On the ASUS boards, frequency quickly drops to just over 4800 MHz with a 48x multiplier. We might expect to see 49x here as well, but the CPU is hitting other limits. During this period, the performance limit is flagged in hardware info with electrical design point or other ICC Max, PL4, SVID, DDR4, or RAPL being the problem. After this point, the two ASUS boards behave differently, with the Extreme sustaining an average clock speed of about 4260 MHz, and the Hero sustaining about 4020 MHz or so, about 4.02 GHz. After the first 56 seconds, the limiting factor becomes PL1, so the frequency is not directly limited, and differences start to emerge. Finally, we've also reported on motherboard manufacturers cheating performance by bumping base clock in the past. This isn't what we're focusing on today, but we pointed out here to show that even when manufacturers obey turbo guidelines, there are other ways to fudge numbers ever so slightly. The MSI, ASRock, and Gigabyte boards reported a proper steady base clock of 100.00 throughout the workloads, with the Master in particular showing zero deviation whatsoever, while both of the ASUS boards fluctuated between 100.4 and 100.5 MHz in the same test. That means that the 53x max turbo multiplier of the 10900K translates to a frequency of 5321 to 5327 MHz for 56 seconds, rather than 5300 MHz like it should be. However, please note that we manually configure B clock to 100.00 for CPU reviews, so this has no impact on the results for the review. As for the reason for the board's different behavior, it becomes more obvious when we look with this tool. The two ASUS boards obey stock guidelines for PL1, PL2, current, multipliers per number of active cores, and multipliers for each individual core. These are the limits that can and will be hit during normal use. The Ace and the Master take the typical MCE approach of maxing out PL1, PL2, and current, but leave the actual turbo multipliers unchanged. Therefore, the boards boost normally, but do so forever, regardless of the turbo limit duration setting, since PL1 and PL2 are the same and the limits can't be hit. The Taichi has the strangest settings. It's set up similarly to the MSI Ace and the Gigabyte Master, but the per core multiplier is unlimited. That means any core can boost to 5.3 GHz instead of just cores 8 or 9. So as reviewers then, wrapping all this up, Patrick and I find MCE unacceptable. We don't think it's okay for a review of a CPU. We can understand why other reviewers might think it is, because from one angle, as long as it's made exceptionally clear to the audience, you might be saying, look, this is how this CPU performs in this platform. But that, for us, is kind of a problem, because we don't want to show you how one CPU performs in one motherboard out of 67 of them. We want to show you how the CPU performs baseline. Anything you get out of that afterwards from overclocking or whatever features the board has that aren't officially stock, or if we use the correct wording, official guidance, same basic thing really. Anything you get beyond that, cool. That's on you, and at that point you can just look at our overclock numbers if that's what you want. But we need a stock baseline, and it has to be fair. That's the whole goal of everything we do here, is to make sure that the testing is fair and presenting both parties, in this instance of duality with CPUs, fairly. So AMD's got settings like PBO and Auto OC. Those are all for AMD. That's because AMD enforces that strictly with the motherboard makers. Intel doesn't really have such a firm grasp of things when it comes to what the motherboard manufacturers are doing. And so you end up with them doing all the stuff we just showed you. And so the end result is that if we start playing with fire and saying, whose guidance are we allowed to ignore? Why are we allowed as reviewers to ignore Intel's official guidance and do whatever the motherboard maker says, but not ignore AMD's official guidance? Is it just because AMD does a better job at enforcing their motherboard partners, like forcing them to do a certain thing? Because if that's the reason, I can tell you right now, the next thing that AMD is going to stop doing, it's going to be telling the motherboard makers, do whatever you want to make it better. Because that's the marketing arms race. That's how it unravels from here. All of this is doubly true for this generation of processors, where the 53x or 49x thermal velocity boost multipliers are so far removed from the 42x, 41x multiplier that the processor actually runs at under a sustained load when obeying Intel guidelines. It's hugely different. As an example, if we were to forget to disable MCE or forget to double check the settings when we start doing a review, we could conclude, potentially erroneously, that the stock 10900K is much hotter, much more power hungry, and much higher performance than it really is, which is why we're careful to adhere to the actually advertised specifications for a review. Intel and AMD both take shots at each other for this in the review guides. As we discussed in the last episode, they're each suggesting the places where the other party should have limits in place. Intel wants PBO off. AMD wants Intel's suggested power limits applied. We don't really care what either party wants from the other because they obviously just want to nerf the performance or make it a level playing field. But their perspective of level is maybe different from ours as a third party. So what we do is we follow the guidance from each party independently of what the other party says about its competitor. The arms race between motherboard manufacturers means that it's unlikely there will be any self-motivated change from that quarter. So real change requires enforcement by Intel. So that is to say that these guidelines should become actual official spec. Firmly, specification. Intel has to put its foot down at some point and say, no, you're doing it this way. And if the user wants extra, they can turn it on. They can flip the switch for MCE. They can flip the switch to turn off all the power limits in Tau, whatever. But it should ship this way stock. That's where Intel has to step in because the motherboard makers are so constantly in a fight because of executives higher up who don't really know exactly what's going on at the lower end of things. They're saying, why is ASRock ahead of us? Why is Gigabyte ahead of us? What can we do to be better? And it's, well, raise the B clock by 0.3. Raise the B clock by 0.8. Where do you stop? Because at some point, it starts to become exceptionally hot, exceptionally high in power consumption, or potentially unstable, as we've seen from our viewers in the audience. And the arms race ultimately escalates. So advertising a tame TDP, which Intel does right now, their TDP is 125 watts. And actually, in reality, that number is pretty close to 1-to-1. If Tau is followed, if PL1 and 2 are followed, that's where it lands after about 56 seconds on these modern boards and CPUs. It lands at about 125 watts for real power consumption. So no, TDP in watts isn't technically the same as just straight power consumption, but it's pretty damn close. And I mean, it lines up almost exactly in a lot of cases where all the limits are followed properly. So it's close enough. And either way, it doesn't really matter if it's the same 1-to-1 because the intent is to say this is the power consumption, but call it something else, which is the amount of cooling power needed to keep the CPU cool. And that's fine, but advertising a tame TDP and also allowing high-end motherboards or any motherboards to essentially auto-OC the CPUs, it's Intel's sorry attempt at having its cake and eating it too, and it's the motherboard makers shamelessly trying to race each other to the bottom for the efficiency of the CPU and potentially stability. So setting MCE to default or auto should mean off, not maybe on. And it's further insane that if you think about this, PC builders have to jump through a hoop just to enable XMP. That's off by default. Why is this on by default? Why is 49X all core so much more agreeable at 1.3 freaking volts for 49X only? Why is that so much more agreeable than XMP? Where's the line drawn? So this is our problem with it ultimately. You get JEDEC involved too, but either way, most of the motherboard manufacturers are cheating with the numbers. They have been, and they will continue to do so. We'll give ASUS credit for being the closest to stock for the most part, sans that one B clock chart. We got them there, but otherwise, ASUS gets a lot of credit for having the simplest solution out of all of these. For some reason, no one else has copied it yet. ASUS says push F1 or F2 when you start the system. F1 is Intel default settings, is what they call it. And then F2 is optimized, which is going to be basically a higher performing version with a higher boosting clock that lasts longer. Again, not more than 4 hours for that, otherwise you need to talk to your technician. But ASUS is the closest there, and the others probably need to follow suit on that. So no default BIOS settings that exceed Intel's guidelines aren't against the rules, and they don't technically break the specification, but the spirit of it is that they do. And they aren't technically considered overclocking, but they misrepresent the CPUs and the motherboards affected, depending on what metric you're looking at. So we're all for the ability to overclock. We do it in all of our reviews. Every single CPU that comes out that we can overclock, we do. Sometimes with liquid nitrogen. But toggling it on by default is irresponsible. And all the boards should run CPUs and every other component at safe and stable settings for that CPU until the user specifies otherwise. So you can watch our recent video on high power consumption for more on that topic, but the only time we think that there's a break from what we've just said is if, let's say, ASUS, Gigabyte, EVGA, whomever advertises this is an XOC board, and this board will do XYZ. This board has 100.8 B clock, this board, whatever. If it's advertised as this will pre-overclock your CPU, that's okay, but it needs to be extremely clear in the marketing. And that's the problem with all of this. So that's it for this one. To support us directly, go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more, and we'll see you all next time.